So my project is about the educational divide between African American children versus white children. The first slide is just about my critical race theory. It's where I discuss I planned to discuss the 5 points. I plan to spend about maybe 5 minutes on this one, just showing my framework and where most of the information is going to be in a critical race framework. Going on to my next slide, it is going to be, what is the gap? Is it big or small? So here I kind of discuss Brown versus education, how the gap is slowly closing, but in reality, it is slowly closing, but in reality, we still do have a long way to go when it comes to bridging that gap between African American students and white students in America today. My next slide is about why is there an educational gap to begin with. And here I go back and I once again talk more into detail about Brown versus education, how African Americans started far behind from the beginning. We started in a very ignorant state. We couldn't read, we couldn't write, and so that started us behind. However, there are other things that also affect it, as in a low income or teachers and schools' lack of accountability to the fact that this is a problem and that this is something that is happening in our schools. I also went on to talk about how standardized testing is geared towards mainly one demographic. It is geared mostly towards white students and people with money who can afford test preps and things of that nature. So I go on to discuss on my next slide how racism contributes to the educational divide. Racism is the reason that the educational divide even exists in the beginning, because due to racism and slavery, African Americans were put behind in the beginning. So racism is a big part of the divide. However, racism from teachers can cause children to dislike school and education. And school racism affects how students view themselves and how students experience their education. Say a student comes to school, they're excited about education, but then all of a sudden all of their teachers don't believe in them. They don't think that they can do it. They don't push them and motivate them like they may do the other students. And that can really affect how a student views their education, or say they have a very bad experience with racism at school and things of that nature. So my next one is the difference between predominantly African American schools versus predominantly white schools. Here I list out a list of things of schools are still very segregated. To this day, there are schools that have mainly black people, and there are schools that have mainly Caucasian people. And the black schools seem to be very segregated. They seem to be in poverty. They don't get as much money, as much books, as much funding. Whereas white schools tend to have more successful alum. They get more money and they have better resources in the end that leads to more success in the long run from their students. The next one is how treatment from teachers can affect the education gap. So, as a teacher, it's very important for all teachers, people becoming teachers and current teachers, to know that the things that are said to students and and the energy we give to students, they can feel it. So if a teacher doesn't believe in you, a teacher gives up on you, a teacher just genuinely doesn't think you can do it, internally that can affect a student for a lifetime. Whereas in the same way, a teacher who is more positive, a teacher who pushes a student, who shows the student they care about them and that they know that they can succeed and they hold them to a high standard, can also push a student to be like, you know what, yes, I can do better. I can be great. My next slide is how do we combat this education gap? So, I put a couple points here. I said to focus more on school districts within focus more on the school districts that are causing the gap. So, for example, the low poverty schools, the schools that don't get enough money, the schools that don't get enough money, the schools that don't have as much funding or as much successful alumni that give the school money, to change our expectations. I think that just because it's a poor neighborhood with maybe poor people and more people of color in the neighborhood, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's a bad school. Or, oh, if you go there, the kids over there, they're not as smart. We shouldn't expect this and this from them. I think all students should be held to the same standard, and not looked down on just because they're poor, that they may not be able to understand what other students will. I also believe that changing funding for predominantly Black schools is a big priority. Predominantly Black schools, poor neighborhood schools, they need funding. I feel like we as a country need to pour more into African American schools and schools in poverty. And on top of that, we need to bring more experienced teachers into the poor neighborhoods. We need experienced teachers who know how to handle situations, who know how to combat difficult things, and who know how to teach all students that come from all backgrounds. And then I go on to talk about my personal experience, how I myself did attend a predominantly white private school, and I also attended a predominantly Black public school, and I just talked about the differences there. I discussed how in public school the tests were longer, harder, and there were a lot fewer of them, whereas in private school the tests were very consistent. We had a test every week. They were shorter and they were more in abundance. So we had tests every week. They were like 6 to 7 questions. So it's like you're getting tested over less information. You're more likely to succeed. I also discussed how some public school teachers didn't have as much time for us as the private school teachers did. And so that's what I went into on that slide. And then my last slide is just my closing notes, where I plan to get everybody into their groups of 3s, where they do their breakout groups, and they will discuss the following questions. There's 4 of them. Do you feel your education was affected by the environment you lived in? Well, they get to choose between the 4 questions. They don't have to answer all 4, but they get to choose 2 of the 4 that they would like to answer and share out to the group. Do you feel your education was affected by the environment you lived in? Do you feel people in different environments have better or worse equal education? What is 2 ways you as a teacher will help close the education gap? What is your biggest takeaway? And then I'll let them go out, do this for about 5 to 10 minutes. Then we'll come back together and I'll ask for questions and ask if anybody would like to share their answers or what they got from the experience. So that's my whole PowerPoint. Thank you.